A civilization thrived for 3,000 years along a thin, fertile ribbon of desert. We know their grand monuments, but what was it actually like to live there? By the end of this, you will understand the ancient Egyptians not as distant legends, but as real people with families, jobs, and dreams. How did a farmer's wife prepare dinner for her children, and what secret hopes did a young scribe whisper to the gods? What does a society that built for eternity teach us about what it means to live a good life? Every single day began and ended with the river. The Nile was not merely a feature on the map for the ancient Egyptians, it was the very source of their breath and bread. Its annual flood was the heartbeat of the nation, a predictable, life-giving miracle in the midst of a relentless desert. Each year, the waters would swell, gently spilling over the banks to coat the arid land in a fresh layer of dark, nutrient-rich silt. This was the gift that made everything else possible, transforming sand into some of the most fertile soil on earth. It was this very soil, this black land, that gave Egypt its oldest name, Kemet. This cycle of the Nile dictated the rhythm of all existence. The Egyptian year was not divided by vague winter or summer, but by the river's three distinct seasons. Ak-Hit was the season of the inundation, when the floodwaters spread across the valley, turning it into a vast, shallow lake. Life during Ak-Hit was a time of waiting and preparation, when farmers could not work their fields and instead were conscripted for national projects, like the building of the very pyramids we marvel at today. As the waters slowly receded, Peret began, the season of emergence. The land, now soaked and blanketed in that precious black silt, emerged ready for planting. This was a frantic, hopeful time of sowing seeds across the freshly revealed earth. Finally came Shemu, the harvest season, when the crops were cut and gathered, filling the granaries that would sustain the kingdom until the cycle began anew. But the Nile was more than just a source of food. It was Egypt's first and most important highway. In a land where deserts presented impassable barriers, the river flowed as a smooth, reliable conduit. Boats laden with grain, stone for temples, and goods from distant lands sailed its length with the current north towards the Mediterranean and with the wind south towards the heart of Africa. This constant flow of people and ideas along the river bound the once separate kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt into a single, cohesive culture. A nobleman in the northern delta and a farmer 1,000 river miles to the south drank the same water, worshipped the same river gods, and lived by the same celestial clock. The Nile did not just feed their bodies, it forged their identity, creating a unified civilization from a string of isolated villages. Rising from the fertile black land was a social structure as monumental and precisely ordered as the pyramids themselves. At the very apex of this pyramid stood one man, the Pharaoh. He was not merely a king, he was considered a living god on earth, the essential intermediary between the divine realm and the human world. His word was law, his responsibility immense, for he alone was tasked with maintaining Ma'at, the fundamental principle of cosmic order, truth, and justice that held chaos at bay. The entire civilization's stability was believed to rest upon his shoulders. Directly beneath this god-king served his most trusted advisor, the vizier. Think of the vizier as the kingdom's chief executive officer, the pharaoh's hands and eyes across the land. He oversaw the treasury, the legal courts, the vast agricultural projects, and the record-keeping that made the state function. To assist him, a privileged class of nobles and high priests managed the regions and the great temples, acting as regional governors and spiritual leaders. But the true engine of this administration was the scribe. In a world where perhaps only 1 in 100 could read and write, the scribe held immense power. These literate men, trained for years in complex hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts, recorded harvests, collected taxes, drafted legal documents, and organized labor. Their famous teaching texts admonished students to embrace the hard work of learning, for the life of a scribe was far superior to that of a manual laborer. Protecting the wealth generated by this system were the soldiers. While not the highest class, a career in the military offered a path to prestige and, after a lifetime of service, a grant of land. They were the guardians of the borders, the enforcers of the pharaoh's will, and the muscle behind Egypt's occasional imperial expansions. Then came the skilled artisans, the stonemasons, carpenters, jewelers, and painters who transformed raw materials into objects of breathtaking beauty and durability. These were the anonymous hands that built the temples, carved the statues, and decorated the tombs, often living in special villages with their families, paid directly by the state. And finally, forming the immense, broad base of the social pyramid, were the farmers and common laborers. They constituted the overwhelming majority of the population. Their lives were dictated by the river's rhythm, spent in the endless cycle of planting, irrigating, and harvesting the grain that fed everyone else. When the floodwaters of Akhet covered their fields, they were conscripted by the state to work on colossal building projects, moving the stones that would become the nation's eternal monuments. A farmer born to a farmer would almost certainly die a farmer. Social mobility was nearly non-existent, yet within this rigid structure there was a profound sense of purpose. From the pharaoh performing sacred rituals to the farmer weeding his plot of land, every person had a role to play in sustaining Maat. This was not just a job, it was a divine duty, a collective effort to keep the world in balance. Their society thrived for millennia not in spite of this hierarchy, but because of the stability and shared identity it provided. This rigid social pyramid was held together by a force more powerful than any pharaoh's decree. Maat was the invisible bedrock of their entire world, a concept so fundamental it is difficult to translate with a single English word. It meant truth, justice, harmony, and the cosmic order that held the forces of chaos and darkness at bay. Every single person, from the god-king on his throne to the farmer in his field, was expected to live in accordance with Maat. It was the moral compass for a society, the reason the sun rose each morning and the Nile flooded each year. To act with greed, to lie, or to disrupt the social order was to introduce Isfet, the chaos and falsehood that threatened to unravel reality itself. This was not an abstract philosophy, it was a daily practice. The pharaoh's most sacred duty was to uphold Maat through rituals and righteous rule, but every honest transaction in the marketplace, every act of kindness to a neighbor, was a small stone added to the great wall protecting civilization from the desert of disorder. And who were the guardians of this delicate balance? A bewildering and wonderfully chaotic family of gods and goddesses. At the head of this divine family was Ra, the mighty sun god, whose journey across the sky in his solar boat brought light and life to the world, and whose perilous voyage through the underworld each night was a constant battle against the serpent of chaos, Apophis. Then there was Osiris, the god of the afterlife, the first mummy and the judge of the dead, whose story of murder and resurrection by his wife Isis offered every Egyptian the hope of eternal life. Isis herself, the devoted wife and powerful magician, was a goddess of motherhood and protection, her wings symbolically sheltering all of Egypt. But beyond these great state deities existed a sprawling network of local and household gods. A fisherman might whisper a prayer to the river god Hapi, while a woman hoping for a child would leave a small offering at a shrine to the hippopotamus goddess Taweret, a fierce protector of mothers in childbirth. This is where we find the true heart of Egyptian faith, not in the grand, inaccessible temples, but in the humble mud brick homes. In a corner of even the most modest dwelling, you would find a small household shrine. Here, a family might keep a statuette of Bes, the dwarf god who warded off evil spirits and protected the household, especially its children. Daily worship was a simple, intimate affair. A person might offer a piece of bread, a bowl of water, or a few flowers to their chosen deity, accompanied by a quiet prayer for health, for a good harvest, or for the protection of a loved one. They were not asking for spiritual salvation in a distant heaven, but for practical help in navigating the challenges of this life and the next. The grand state religion and this personal, home-centered faith were not separate. They were two sides of the same coin, both essential for maintaining the balance of mat and ensuring that life, in all its forms, would continue to flourish along the Nile. Within the sturdy mud-brick walls of these homes, life unfolded with a rhythm both simple and profound. For the vast majority of Egyptians, a house was a single-story structure rising directly from the black soil, built from the earth itself. The primary building block was the sun-dried mud brick, a mixture of Nile mud and straw, formed in wooden molds and baked hard by the relentless sun. These thick walls were the key to survival, acting as a natural insulator against the blistering daytime heat and the surprising chill of the desert night. A roof of palm log beams topped with layers of woven mats and more mud provided a sturdy ceiling. Stepping inside, your feet would meet floors of packed earth or simple woven reed mats, cool and practical. The layout of a commoner's home was a model of efficient design. You would typically enter into a central room, the heart of the household. This was the main living area where the family gathered, meals were eaten, and daily chores were completed. Off this central space were smaller, darker rooms used for sleeping. Privacy was a limited concept. The kitchen was often a designated area in the main room or a separate, semi-open space at the back of the house, centered around a simple clay oven for baking bread and a fire pit for cooking stews. Below ground, a cellar provided crucial storage for grain, beer, and other supplies, keeping them cool and safe. But for the wealthy noble or high official, a home was a statement of status and a sanctuary of comfort. Their villas were sprawling complexes surrounded by high walls. Inside, you might find multiple reception halls with painted columns, private family suites, and dedicated rooms for servants. The true luxury was found outside in the garden. A wealthy Egyptian's garden was a miniature paradise, a controlled oasis with a rectangular pond stocked with fish, shaded by fig and date trees, and filled with the scent of flowering plants like mandrakes and poppies. This was a private place of rest and beauty, a world away from the dusty streets. Furniture in any home, however, was strikingly minimal by our modern standards. There were no large wardrobes or bulky couches. Possessions were stored in wooden chests and baskets. People sat on low, backless stools, ate from small wooden tables, and slept on simple wooden bed frames with a mattress of woven cord. Perhaps the most distinctive item was the headrest, a carved wooden stand that supported the neck during sleep. It looks incredibly uncomfortable to us, but for the Egyptians, it was not only practical for keeping cool, but was also imbued with magical protection, often carved with the image of Bes to guard the sleeper from nightmares. Every aspect of the home's design served the single, vital purpose of managing the climate. Windows were small, narrow openings set high on the walls. This clever design allowed hot air to rise and escape while keeping the harsh, direct sunlight out and letting in only a soft, diffused light. The thick mud brick walls absorbed the daytime heat, releasing it slowly during the cooler night. In the grand villas, these principles were amplified with shaded porticos and courtyards designed to catch the slightest breeze. This was architecture born of necessity, a perfect adaptation to an unforgiving environment, creating spaces that were not just shelters but comfortable centers for a family's entire world. The air in an Egyptian home was thick with the warm, earthy scent of baking bread. This simple staple was the true foundation of their civilization, eaten by the pharaoh in his palace and the farmer in his field. Bread was more than just food, it was life itself, baked daily from grains like emmer wheat and barley. The process was a cornerstone of daily life. Women would grind the grain on a flat stone saddle quern, a tedious and laborious task to produce a coarse flour. This flour was then mixed with water and a bit of old dough to start fermentation, creating a dense, hearty loaf often baked in conical clay ovens. Sometimes sand and grit from the milling stones would get into the dough, and archaeologists can see the wear on ancient Egyptian teeth from a lifetime of chewing this essential, if slightly abrasive, food. And what did they wash this bread down with? The national drink was beer. This was not the clear, fizzy beverage we know today, but a thick, cloudy, and nutritious porridge like brew. It was less alcoholic than modern beer, packed with vitamins and calories, and so vital that it was often used as a form of payment for state workers, including the men who built the pyramids. A standard ration for a laborer might include several loaves of bread and several jugs of this sustaining beer, consumed by people of all ages and social classes. But the Egyptian table offered far more than just bread and beer. A colorful array of vegetables filled out their meals. Onions, garlic, and leeks were the fundamental flavor base for countless stews and dishes. They grew cucumbers and lettuce in their garden plots and relied heavily on lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans, which provided crucial protein for the vast majority of the population who could not afford meat every day. For a touch of sweetness, they turned to the fruits that thrived in the Nile Valley. Dates were a universal favorite, eaten fresh or dried, and even pressed into a sweet syrup. Figs, grapes, and the tart pulp of the sycamore fig provided delicious snacks and natural desserts. Honey, a rare and expensive commodity, was the primary sweetener, treasured by the wealthy and used in special recipes and offerings to the gods. When it came to meat, your social class dictated what was on your plate. For the wealthy elite, a feast might feature roasted beef, tender goose, or duck. But for the common family, such luxuries were for rare festivals. Their regular protein came from the river and the marshes. The annual migration of Nile perch was a major event, with huge catches being dried and salted to preserve them. They also snared wild fowl from the papyrus thickets and supplemented their diet with fish from the river. This diet, born directly from the gifts of the Nile and the labor of their own hands, was both practical and surprisingly diverse. It sustained a people who saw the very act of eating and drinking as a sacred part of a life lived in harmony with the world around them. Even the clothes they wore were a direct response to the sun's relentless gaze. In a land of scorching days, the ancient Egyptian wardrobe was a masterpiece of practicality and elegant simplicity, designed for one primary purpose: to keep the body cool and protected. The fabric of choice was linen, woven from the fibers of the flax plant. This was not a matter of fashion preference, but of brilliant adaptation. Linen is lightweight, breathable, and absorbs moisture, making it the perfect textile for the Nile Valley's heat. But this seemingly simple fabric also told a silent, powerful story about a person's place in the world. The quality of the linen was a direct indicator of social status. For the pharaoh and the elite, weavers created linen of astonishing fineness, woven so tightly it could be almost transparent and soft as silk. A noblewoman's dress might float around her, a whisper of wealth. For the farmer or the laborer, the linen was coarse and thick, a durable, rough-textured garment meant to withstand a hard day's work in the fields. The basic forms of these garments were remarkably consistent across centuries. For men, the standard attire was the shenty, a simple kilt wrapped around the waist and tied with a knot. Its length could vary, sometimes reaching to the knee for a worker needing freedom of movement, or hanging longer for an official in a formal setting. Women typically wore a long, straight, sheath-like dress, snug to the body with one or two shoulder straps. This elegant, columnar silhouette is one of the most enduring images of ancient Egypt. Children, interestingly, often went without any clothing at all in the searing heat until they reached puberty, a practical concession to comfort and the swift passage of childhood. Yet, if their clothing was minimalist, their adornment was anything but. Jewelry was worn by everyone from the highest priest to the humblest farmer. This was not merely for decoration. Every piece served a potent magical purpose. A wide, colorful collar necklace called a wesek was a common sight. Often made from thousands of bright blue faience beads, a ceramic material glazed to mimic precious stones, These collars were believed to protect the neck, a vulnerable area, from evil forces. Amulets shaped like scarab beetles, the symbol of rebirth or the protective eye of Horus, were woven into necklaces or worn as rings. For those who could afford it, jewelry was crafted from gold, which the Egyptians considered the flesh of the gods, and inlaid with lapis lazuli, carnelian, and turquoise. Even a simple pair of earrings or a copper bracelet was a portable shrine, a layer of divine defense worn on the body. Perhaps their most striking feature was their hair, or rather, their lack of it. For both hygiene and comfort in the hot, dusty environment, most Egyptians shaved their heads and routinely removed body hair, but a bald head was then transformed into a canvas for elaborate wigs. These were not just simple hairpieces, but complex constructions of human hair, plant fibers, or wool, often woven with beeswax and resin into intricate braids and curls. A wealthy woman might own several wigs, one for a festive occasion, heavy with perfumed cones of fat that would slowly melt and scent her throughout the evening, and a simpler one for daily household tasks. Wigs protected the sensitive scalp from the sun, helped prevent lice, and were the ultimate symbol of cultivated beauty, separating the refined wearer from the unkempt world of the desert. In this way, every aspect of their appearance, from the plainest linen kilt to the most dazzling golden collar, was a thoughtful blend of necessity, divine belief, and a quiet, personal statement of identity. A world of knowledge was etched not in stone, but on the humble surface of a broken pottery shard. For the few, the privileged boys chosen for an education, this was where their future began. Their classroom was the House of Life, a sacred institution attached to a major temple, part library, part scriptorium, and part school. Here, the air was thick with the smell of ink and the quiet murmur of recitation, a world apart from the physical labor that defined most Egyptian lives. The goal was singular and immensely ambitious: to master the 3 intricate scripts of the language. They began with the beautiful pictorial hieroglyphs, sacred writing reserved for temple walls and royal tombs. Then came the practical cursive form known as hieratic, the script of administration and daily record-keeping, flowing from the reed brush much faster than carved symbols. In the later periods, they might even learn demotic, an even more streamlined script for legal and commercial documents. This was not a gentle education. It was a grueling process of relentless memorization and precise copying. A student spent years hunched over ostraca, those cheap and readily available flakes of limestone or broken pottery, practicing his signs over and over again. He would copy out classic texts like the Satire of the Trades, which vividly described the miserable lot of the farmer, the soldier, and the washerman, all to reinforce one central message. "How fortunate you are," the text would croon, "to be a scribe whose hands remain clean and whose back remains straight." Only after he had achieved a certain level of mastery would he be trusted with a sheet of precious papyrus, the true paper of the ancient world. The teacher, a seasoned scribe himself, would scrutinize every stroke, correcting errors and demanding perfection. Why such relentless discipline? Because the reward at the end of this arduous path was a life of unparalleled power and prestige. The scribe was the administrator, the accountant, the lawyer, and the historian of his society. He was exempt from the back-breaking manual labor, the taxes in grain, and the military conscription that fell upon other men. His was the power of the written word. With a flick of his reed brush, he could record the harvest from 1,000 fields, calculate the taxes owed to the state, draft a marriage contract, or inscribe a royal decree that would echo through the ages. He was the invisible engine of the empire, the one who made the vast, complex machinery of the Egyptian state function smoothly. The entire civilization, with its granaries, its building projects, and its trade networks, depended entirely on his ability to read, write, and count. He held the records of the past and the accounts of the present in his head and in his hands, a position of quiet, immense authority that made him indispensable to the God King himself. A broken bone was set with the same certainty as a spell was recited against a fever demon. In the world of ancient Egyptian healing, there was no line between the clinic and the temple, between a physician's prescription and a priest's incantation. This was a holistic system where science and spirit were two essential tools in the same kit, both aimed at restoring a person's health, which was seen as a state of balance within the body and with the divine. The men who practiced this art were often priests of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess who could unleash plagues or cure them. This dual identity made perfect sense, for who better to fight a disease caused by an angry deity than a servant of that very power? These physician priests possessed a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of the human body, knowledge gained from the sacred, practical art of mummification. While they did not dissect bodies for pure science, the process of preparing the dead gave them an intimate view of the internal organs, the skeleton, and the network of vessels. They documented this in medical papyri, listing individual bones and describing the pulse as a system of channels carrying air, water, and blood, a concept not far from our own understanding of circulation. Their treatments could be remarkably effective. They knew that honey was a powerful natural antiseptic and used it to dress wounds, preventing infection in a way we now understand scientifically. For pain and inflammation, they prescribed willow leaves, which contain salicin, the natural compound from which aspirin is derived. They used yeast from beer for skin infections and castor oil as a laxative. They even had tests for fertility and pregnancy, yet for every physical remedy there was a spiritual counterpart. An illness was rarely seen as just a biological malfunction. It could be the work of a vengeful ghost, the intrusion of a demon, or a punishment from a god for a moral failing. Therefore, a diagnosis of a fever required not just a cooling poultice, but also a spell to drive out the invading spirit. A physician might write a protective incantation on a piece of papyrus, dissolve the ink in water, and have the patient drink it, literally consuming the magic words. Amulets, especially the wedged eye of Horus, were prescribed to be worn over an injury or a diseased organ, channeling divine protection directly to the afflicted area. This was not a sign of ignorance, but a reflection of a world view where every aspect of reality was interconnected. To cure the body, you had to also placate the spirit and restore the patient's harmony with the cosmic order. The Egyptian healer addressed the whole person, treating the broken bone and the broken piece with the gods as two parts of the same essential cure. The scent of baking bread was a luxury earned by endless toil under the harsh sun. For the farmer, who was the true backbone of Egypt, life was a relentless cycle dictated by the soil itself. His year began not on a calendar, but with the retreat of the Nile's floodwaters. As the black land of Kemet emerged soggy and fertile, the first and most grueling task was to prepare the fields. He would guide a wooden plow, often pulled by a pair of oxen, through the heavy, wet earth. His wife or children would follow behind, breaking up the larger clods of rich soil with hoes. This was back-breaking labor under a sky that offered little shade. Once the earth was turned and soft, the sowing began. He would walk the fields with a basket of seed slung over his shoulder, casting emmer wheat or barley in wide, practiced arcs, trusting the fertile silt to do its work. But the land was thirsty. The river had receded, and to keep the young plants alive, a constant battle against drought was fought with simple, brilliant technology. The shaduf was his constant companion, a simple lever made from a long pole with a bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other. He would spend his days in a rhythmic dip and lift, hauling water from the irrigation canals to the thirsty fields, a motion repeated thousands of times from dawn until dusk. This was not a solitary life. The harvest was a massive communal effort. When the golden grain stood tall, entire villages would work together. Teams of men moved in unison, swinging wooden sickles with flint blades to cut the stalks, while women and children followed, gathering the sheaves. The air would be thick with chaff and the sounds of shared labor and song. Yet the state always had its claim. The farmer's obligation did not end with feeding his family and his community. He owed a labor tax to the pharaoh, a duty known as corvée. When the inundation season of Akhit flooded his fields and made farming impossible, he was conscripted. This was how the pyramids rose. He would join a national army of labor, traveling to distant quarries to haul stone or to the royal necropolis to move massive blocks into place. This service was an obligation, a form of taxation paid with sweat and muscle, but it was also a sacred duty. By building the pharaoh's eternal tomb, he was participating in a project that ensured the continued favor of the gods and the stability of Mot itself. His hands, which coaxed food from the earth, were also shaping the very monuments that would define his civilization for millennia. The rhythmic scrape of a copper chisel against limestone was the sound of eternity being carved. While the farmer worked the land, another class of Egyptians transformed raw materials into the civilization's enduring glory. These were the skilled artisans, the anonymous hands that built the gods' houses and the pharaoh's tombs. Their work was a symphony of specialized trades, each one a vital part of a grand, state-directed project. The stonemason was a master of geometry and brute force, using dolerite pounding stones to precisely shape the colossal blocks for pyramids and temples. The carpenter, with his adzes and saws, turned acacia and sycamore fig wood into everything from sturdy roof beams to elegant furniture and the sacred barks that carried statues of the gods. In the jeweler's workshop, the air would have glittered with dust from precious stones. These craftsmen practiced the art of inlay, setting brilliant blue lapis lazuli and deep red carnelian into golden settings to create the magnificent collars and amulets that adorned the elite. Even the humble potter, spinning his wheel with his feet, was essential, producing the vast array of vessels needed for daily life, from the simple beer jar found in every home to the ornate ceremonial pots used in temple rituals. For the most prestigious projects, these men and their families lived in special, planned communities. The most famous of these was Deir el-Medina, a village nestled in a secluded valley near Thebes. Here, the workmen who carved and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings resided. Life in this village was a world within a world. These were not slaves, but state employees, highly respected for their irreplaceable skills. They were paid not in coin, but in practical rations that sustained their entire households, measured out in emmer wheat, barley, fish, vegetables, and the oil needed for lamps and cooking. Their work was demanding and dangerous, yet they enjoyed a level of autonomy unseen by the common farmer. Records from Deir el-Medina show they had their own local court to settle disputes, could own personal property, and even went on strike when their rations were delayed, a powerful testament to their collective value. They were the essential link between the pharaoh's divine vision and the physical world, the human machinery that turned stone, wood, and metal into a legacy meant to last for all time. The same hands that carved monuments also signed legal contracts. For a civilization built on divine order, justice on the ground was a practical matter, a system designed to resolve disputes and keep the community intact. At the top of this legal structure was the vizier, the pharaoh's chief minister. He served as the supreme judge, the final court of appeal for the entire kingdom. But the vast majority of legal matters never reached his desk. Day-to-day justice was handled by local councils of elders known as kenbet. These were not professional lawyers or full-time judges, but respected members of the community: priests, scribes, military officers, and wealthy landowners who gathered to hear cases in their town or village. They were the neighborhood arbiters, the ones you would turn to if your neighbor stole your goat or a business deal went sour. The guiding principle for every case, whether a quarrel over a donkey or a claim of assault, was the restoration of Mat. The goal was not merely to punish a wrongdoer, but to repair the tear in the social fabric, to bring the community back into balance. To achieve this, the kenbet relied on concrete evidence. Witness testimony was paramount. A person's word was their bond, and witnesses were expected to speak the truth under oath to the gods. For more complex transactions, written documents were crucial. Scribes drafted detailed contracts for marriages, property sales, and business partnerships, and these papyri were considered powerful, undeniable proof in any dispute. Punishments were calibrated to fit both the crime and the need for restitution. For common theft, a culprit might be ordered to repay double the value of what was stolen or receive a public beating. This was justice with a clear economic and social purpose, forcing the offender to make the victim whole while suffering a public shaming that reinforced the rules for everyone. But for crimes that struck at the very heart of Mat, the penalties were severe and terrifying. Tomb robbery was considered a direct attack on the eternal peace of the dead and a theft from the gods themselves, an offense that could bring the curse of chaos upon the entire land. The punishment was often execution. Treason against the pharaoh, the living god, was the ultimate act of isfet, and it was met with the ultimate penalty, sometimes even extending to the erasure of the traitor's name and image from all monuments, a second death meant to obliterate their very memory. In the most extreme cases, mutilation, the cutting off of a nose, ears, or a hand, was used not just as a physical penalty, but as a permanent, visible brand of dishonor. This legal system was a reflection of the society itself, a blend of pragmatic community resolution and absolute divine authority. It sought to balance the scales, to make the victim whole, and to warn others away from chaos, all in the unending effort to preserve the delicate harmony of the two lands. A contract was signed not in a cold courtroom, but within the warmth of the family home. The ancient Egyptians did not see marriage as a grand romantic ceremony overseen by priests, but as a practical, social agreement between two people and their families. Most marriages were arranged, a sensible union meant to combine resources, continue family lines, and create a new, stable economic unit. Yet, the legal documents and personal letters they left behind reveal a world where deep affection and mutual respect were the true foundations of a household. A woman entered marriage with remarkable rights for the ancient world. She retained full ownership of any property she brought with her, and any assets she acquired during the marriage remained hers alone. This was not a relationship of ownership, but a partnership. She was called the Lady of the House, a title that carried real authority over the domestic sphere and the family's finances. And if a marriage became unbearable, if a husband was abusive or failed in his duties, a woman had the legal right to initiate a divorce and leave with her original dowry and a share of the couple's joint property. This legal framework protected her, ensuring she was never a powerless dependent. The ultimate purpose of this partnership was the creation of a family, and here, the emotional world of the Egyptians opens up to us with touching clarity. Children were not just a hope, they were a divine blessing, the very source of a person's immortality, as it was one's children who were expected to perform the funeral rites that ensured eternal life. From the moment a child was born, they were enveloped in love and protection. Tomb scenes show fathers cradling infants with evident tenderness and mothers nursing their babies, their postures radiating a familiar, timeless devotion. A letter from a scribe stationed far from home chides his wife for not writing to him, but his main concern is for his young son. Tell him, the scribe writes, that the Pharaoh's chariot is waiting for him, a father's playful boast meant to bridge the distance between them. Children's lives were a blend of responsibility and simple joy. They played with toys that would feel familiar even today, spinning tops, pulling wooden animals on wheels, and tossing balls made of leather or papyrus. Little girls cradled dolls with detailed hair made of clay beads, but childhood was also brief. As soon as they were able, they were expected to contribute to the household. A young girl might help her mother grind grain or weave linen, while a boy would follow his father into the fields or the workshop, learning the trade he would inherit. Through it all, the evidence of a deep, abiding bond is everywhere. In a tomb, you might see a carving of a man with his arm wrapped around his wife's shoulder, their children clustered at their feet. In a personal letter, a husband refers to his wife as "my sister," a term of the utmost endearment. They worried about their children's health, celebrated their milestones, and poured their hopes into their futures. The great monuments of stone speak of gods and kings, but the quiet evidence from the home tells a more universal story, one of love, worry, and the simple, profound desire to build a life together that would last in its own way for an eternity. But life was not all work and solemn ritual. The banks of the Nile also echoed with music, laughter, and the joyous noise of celebration. The Egyptian calendar was punctuated by numerous religious festivals, days when the boundary between the human world and the divine grew thin and the entire community came together. One of the most personal was the beautiful Festival of the Valley. During this event, the statues of the gods and the revered spirits of past pharaohs would be carried in their sacred barks from their grand temples across the river to the necropolis on the west bank. Families would follow in a great, solemn yet celebratory procession, carrying offerings of food and drink to their own ancestral tombs. They would picnic among the graves, sharing a meal with their departed loved ones, reaffirming the bonds of family that even death could not sever. It was a day of remembrance, a communal act of love that connected the present to the past. On a much grander scale was the Opet Festival. This was a state spectacle of immense power and pageantry. The statues of the gods Ammon, Mut, and Khonsu were taken from their temple at Karnak and paraded with great fanfare to the temple of Luxor. The procession was a river of humanity, with priests, soldiers, dancers, and musicians moving along the avenue of sphinxes. The air would have been thick with the smell of incense and the sound of sistrum rattles. The entire purpose of this lavish event was to ritually rejuvenate the power of the pharaoh, to recharge the divine energy that maintained Maat for another year. For the average person, it was a thrilling public holiday, a chance to see the god king and the sacred images usually hidden deep within temple sanctuaries. At home, leisure was simpler but just as cherished. Board games were a universal pastime. The most popular was Senet, a game played on a grid of 30 squares. Families would spend evenings hunched over their game boards, moving carved pieces, but this was more than just a game. Senet was a symbolic journey of the soul through the underworld, a playful rehearsal for the ultimate voyage to the afterlife. Winning was a good omen, a sign of the gods' favor. For those who could get away, a day spent hunting fowl in the marshes with throwing sticks was a beloved escape. They would glide through the papyrus thickets in light papyrus skiffs, seeking duck, geese, and heron. This was not just for food, it was a sport, a return to a wilder, more primal Egypt. Music filled the air at every level of society. A small household might enjoy the gentle notes of a harp or a lute played by a family member, while a wealthy noble would host a banquet with professional musicians, singers, and dancers performing for his guests. These feasts were the height of social pleasure. Guests, dressed in their finest linen and elaborate wigs, would recline on cushions. Servants would circulate with platters of roast meat, baskets of figs and dates, and endless jars of beer and wine. And atop the heads of the most distinguished guests, you would see a curious sight, a perfumed cone of solid fat, often scented with myrrh or frankincense. As the evening wore on and the room grew warm, this cone would slowly melt, releasing a trickle of fragrant oil that cooled the scalp and scented the wig and clothing, a luxurious, living perfume that embodied the sheer sensory pleasure of being alive in that moment. The meaning of eternity was carved in stone, but the business of the day was written in ink. We often think of ancient Egyptian writing as a gallery of beautiful pictures, a secret code of birds and snakes and eyes. The truth is far more brilliant and complex. Hieroglyphs were a sophisticated fusion of art and language, a system that used symbols both for their meaning and for their sound. Some symbols, called logograms, did represent a whole word. The simple drawing of a sun disk meant the word sun, and the glyph of a seated man could mean man. But the real key to unlocking the script lies in the phonograms, symbols that represented consonant sounds, completely independent of the object they depicted. For example, the glyph of an owl was not used to write about birds, it stood for the M sound. The water ripple glyph represented the N sound, and the basket glyph carried the hard K sound. This is how they could write abstract words, names, and complex ideas. Let us take a name we all know, Cleopatra. In Egyptian hieroglyphs, her name was spelled out phonetically. It began with a cloth for the K sound, a lion for L, a reed leaf for the vowel indicator I, a knot for O, a stool for P, a reed leaf again for a hand for T, and a mouth for R. The famous Carthage oval encircled it all, declaring it a royal name. This elegant combination of sound and sense symbols allowed scribes to record everything from royal decrees to love poetry. But carving these intricate symbols into temple walls was a slow, sacred process. For the rapid-fire needs of administration, for tax records, letters, and legal documents, they developed a cursive script called hieratic. This was hieroglyphs in motion, written with a reed brush on papyrus or pottery shards, its forms flowing and simplified for speed. Centuries later, an even more streamlined script emerged, Demotic, which became the standard for everyday business and literature. For over 1,000 years, the knowledge of how to read these scripts vanished, and the voices of the ancient Egyptians fell silent. The key that finally turned the lock was a slab of black granodiorite known as the Rosetta Stone. Discovered by a French soldier in 1799, this stone bore the same decree in 3 scripts: Classical Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphs. Scholars could read the Greek. For decades, they painstakingly matched the known Greek text to the unknown Egyptian scripts, with the final breakthrough coming from the French scholar Jean-François Champollion. He realized that the royal names within the Cartouches were not just symbolic but phonetic. By comparing the hieroglyphs for the names Ptolemy and Cleopatra to their Greek equivalents, he confirmed the phonetic principle and began to reconstruct the alphabet of sounds. It was a moment of resurrection. The stone gave up its secret and the wall of silence crumbled. For the first time in millennia, the ancient Egyptians could speak to the modern world in their own words, their prayers, their jokes, and their accounts now audible across the centuries. The grain filling the royal granaries was a form of power, a silent currency that could be traded for the very things the Nile Valley lacked. While the fertile black land was the foundation of Egypt's wealth, its true economic engine was a sophisticated network of trade and tribute that stretched across the known world. The Egyptians were masterful exporters, sending their surplus wheat and barley to feed neighboring lands, and shipping out the legendary gold mined from the deserts of Nubia to the south. Their workshops produced a surplus of fine linen, a fabric so prized it was bundled and sent north to the palaces of the Levant. But for all their agricultural and mineral riches, Egypt was poor in other essential resources. They had no great forests, so the mighty cedar wood needed for temple doors and sacred river barges had to be imported from the distant mountains of Lebanon. Their religious rituals demanded vast quantities of incense, the fragrant resin that sweetened the air in the temples and pleased the gods, and this came from the mysterious, far-off land of Punt, a place they reached by sailing down the Red Sea. And for the most exquisite jewelry, they sought lapis lazuli, a stone of the deepest, most celestial blue, which could only be found in the remote mines of what is now Afghanistan. This flow of goods was managed through 2 distinct channels. The first was straightforward commercial trade. Egyptian merchants, often acting as agents for the state, would negotiate with their counterparts in other kingdoms, bartering Egyptian gold and grain for Lebanese timber or Aegean olive oil. These were business transactions recorded meticulously by scribes, but the second channel, tribute, was something else entirely. When the Pharaoh's armies conquered a territory, that land was expected to pay tribute. This was not a voluntary trade, but a compulsory payment, a sign of submission to the Pharaoh's power. Each year, or after a successful military campaign, foreign princes would lead processions into Egypt, bringing the unique wealth of their homelands as gifts for the living god. The scenes carved on temple walls show Nubians presenting rings of gold, ebony, and panther skins, Syrians offering bears, horses, and elaborate vessels. This tribute was a public performance of Egypt's dominance, a flow of luxury and raw materials that poured directly into the state's treasuries without anything given in return. It demonstrated to everyone, foreigner and Egyptian alike, that the pharaoh's power reached far beyond the borders of the two lands, bringing the world's riches to the banks of the Nile and fueling a prosperity that made the civilization's grandest monuments possible. A soldier's pension was not paid in gold, but in a plot of fertile land along the Nile. For a common boy born to a farmer, the army offered one of the few reliable paths out of a life of endless toil. The military was a professional, organized force, a pyramid of its own with the pharaoh as its supreme commander. At its peak were the elite charioteers, the ancient equivalent of special forces. A chariot team was a two-man unit of incredible speed and power, a blur of polished wood and gleaming bronze. The driver controlled the horses, maneuvering the lightweight vehicle across the battlefield, while the warrior beside him, armed with a powerful composite bow, unleashed a storm of arrows. This was a role for the sons of nobles, requiring immense skill, expensive equipment, and unwavering courage. Beneath them marched the backbone of the army, the standard infantry. These men were organized into divisions, each named for an Egyptian god, like the division of Ammon or the division of Ra. A soldier's kit was practical and deadly. He carried a simple wooden bow and a quiver of arrows, a long spear for thrusting at the enemy line, and a cowhide shield for protection. His uniform was a simple linen kilt, and his head was often shaved, not for comfort alone, but to provide a smooth surface for the heavy, cumbersome wigs that were part of his formal military dress. The life of an infantryman was one of grueling discipline and long periods of boredom punctuated by flashes of sheer terror. Much of his time was spent on garrison duty, stationed in massive mud-brick forts along Egypt's borders. In the scorching eastern desert, he would stand watch over the trade routes into Canaan, scanning the horizon for raiders. In the south, in the harsh landscape of Nubia, he guarded the river approaches and the vital gold mines that filled the pharaoh's treasury. But when the call to campaign came, his world transformed. He would march for weeks, his sandals wearing thin on the stony desert paths, his water skin a precious burden. He might find himself fighting in the wooded hills of Canaan, storming a fortified city, or in the dense, alien marshes of Nubia, where the fighting style was entirely different. The risks were immense, but so were the potential rewards. A successful campaign meant plunder, a share of the captured goods, weapons, and precious metals. Most importantly, after a lifetime of loyal service, a veteran could expect a grant of land from the pharaoh. This was the ultimate prize, a piece of the black land that would sustain his family for generations, elevating him from a landless soldier to a respected landowner in his community. This system of potential reward bound the army's loyalty directly to the pharaoh. The military was not just a defensive shield, it was the active fist of Egyptian power, projecting the pharaoh's will far beyond the Nile Valley to secure the timber, copper, and gold that the civilization needed to thrive. It was a brutal, demanding career, but for the ambitious, it was a gamble that could transform a destiny written at birth. A soldier's reward of land was a promise of security in this life, but every Egyptian's ultimate hope was for a safe passage into the next. Death was not a terrifying finality for them, but a profound transition, a journey to the west where the sun died each evening. They called this new, perfect world the Field of Reeds, a blessed realm that was a flawless mirror of Egypt itself, but without sorrow, disease, or hunger. Here, the Nile flowed just as steadily, the crops grew eternally abundant, and a person could enjoy the best of life forever. But reaching this paradise required navigating the most dangerous voyage of all. When a person died, their life force, their ba, was released. Think of the ba as the unique personality and spirit of the individual, often depicted as a human-headed bird. This ba had to embark on a treacherous journey through the underworld, a dark and labyrinthine landscape filled with terrifying demons, lakes of fire, and mysterious gates guarded by fearsome creatures. The soul had to know the correct names of these guardians and the right spells to bypass them, which is why the Book of the Dead, a collection of magical instructions and maps, was so often buried with the deceased. This perilous path had a single, terrifying destination, the Hall of Mot. Here, in the ultimate courtroom, the deceased would stand before a tribunal of gods with Osiris, the lord of the afterlife, presiding as the final judge. The central moment of this judgment was the weighing of the heart. The deceased's heart, believed to be the seat of all memory, emotion, and conscience, was placed on one side of a giant scale. On the other side was the feather of Mot, the symbol of truth, justice, and cosmic order. The gods would watch in silence as the scale tipped. If the heart was light, unburdened by lies, greed, or violence, it balanced perfectly with the feather. This was the moment of triumph, granting the soul admission to the eternal bliss of the field of reeds. But if the heart was heavy with sin, weighed down by a life lived in chaos, the scale would sink. A monstrous hybrid creature, part lion, part hippopotamus, and part crocodile, known as Ammit, the devourer of the dead, would lunge forward and consume the heart. This was the second death, a complete and final annihilation of the soul from which there was no return. This belief made a moral life absolutely essential for salvation. It was not enough to simply have your body mummified and your tomb stocked with offerings. You had to be able to stand before Osiris and truthfully declare you had not stolen, you had not murdered, you had not caused anyone to go hungry. Your own heart would testify against you. This was the final, powerful incentive to live in accordance with Mot every single day, for your eternal fate literally rested in the balance. The ultimate test in the Hall of Mot required a physical body. If the soul was to enjoy the field of reeds, it needed a home to return to, a permanent vessel for the eternal spirit. This profound need gave birth to one of history's most intricate and sacred sciences, the practice of mummification. This was not a morbid obsession with death, but a practical, deeply spiritual process to preserve the body for its endless journey. The entire ritual was a carefully choreographed operation lasting 70 days, a period that mirrored the cycle of the star Sirius, whose reappearance in the sky heralded the Nile's life-giving flood. It was a symbolic rebirth. The work was performed by specialized priests who wore masks of the jackal god Anubis, the guardian of cemeteries. They were not butchers, but ritual technicians acting under divine authority. The process began with the most invasive step. The embalmers would carefully remove the internal organs through a small incision in the left side of the abdomen. The brain, considered unimportant, was typically broken apart and extracted in fragments through the nose using long, hooked bronze tools. These organs were then cleansed and dehydrated. But one organ was always left meticulously in place, the heart. As the seat of a person's intelligence, memory, and conscience, it was essential for the final judgment before Osiris. Without a heart, the soul could not be weighed. The other organs, however, found their own sacred containers. They were individually preserved and placed inside a set of 4 canopic jars. Each jar was topped with a stopper carved as one of the 4 sons of Horus, and each deity protected a specific organ. Imseti, with a human head, guarded the liver. Hapi, the baboon-headed god, watched over the lungs. Dumutef, with the head of a jackal, protected the stomach, and Kebesanuf, the falcon-headed god, kept the intestines safe. With the organs removed, the real work of preservation could begin. The body cavity was rinsed with palm wine and aromatic spices to kill bacteria, then packed with temporary stuffing. Next came the crucial dehydration. The body was completely covered in a special salt called natron. a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate that was harvested from dry lake beds. This was not table salt, but a powerful desiccant. For 40 days, the body would lie in this natron bed, which slowly and steadily drew out all the moisture from the tissues, leaving the skin and bones leathery and dry. After this, the temporary stuffing was removed and the desiccated body was washed again. Then, the priests performed their final act of restoration. The body was packed with clean linen, sawdust, or other materials to restore a lifelike shape to the withered limbs. Often, the skin was anointed with oils and resins, which not only smelled fragrant but also helped to waterproof the body. Sometimes, for the wealthiest clients, the priests even painted the fingernails and toenails or applied cosmetics to the face, all to make the deceased presentable for eternity. The final and most magical stage was the wrapping. This was a days-long ritual in itself. The body was swaddled in hundreds of yards of linen bandages. As the priests wound each layer, they recited spells and tucked powerful amulets between the folds. A scarab beetle amulet was placed over the heart, inscribed with a spell commanding the heart not to betray its owner in the final judgment. The wedged eye of Horus offered protection and healing. Golden sheaths were fitted over the fingers and toes. Every amulet, every incantation was another layer of divine armor for the perilous journey ahead. The entire 70-day process was a breathtaking fusion of spiritual belief and practical chemistry. It was an exclusive and expensive service reserved for the pharaoh and the elite. Yet the desire for immortality was a universal hope. For ordinary Egyptians who could not afford such elaborate rites, simpler methods were available. A body might be treated with a rudimentary application of resin or simply buried in the hot, dry sand of the desert, which could naturally desiccate and preserve it. From the most magnificent royal mummy to the simplest desert burial, the goal was the same: to cheat decay and secure a place in the eternal field of reeds. A preserved body was only the first step toward eternity. That mummy needed a permanent home, a sealed fortress where the spirit could dwell in safety and comfort for all time. This was the tomb, conceived not as a gloomy crypt, but as a vibrant eternal residence, stocked with every necessity and luxury the deceased would require in the field of reeds. The very architecture of these homes for the dead tells a story of evolving beliefs and escalating security concerns. The earliest elite tombs were mastabas, low, flat-roofed rectangular structures made of mud brick. They were practical houses for the spirit, with a chapel above ground for offerings and a burial chamber deep below. But for a pharaoh, a simple house was not enough. The first pyramid was a staircase to the stars, a colossal symbol of the sun god's rays piercing the earth. The step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara was a revolutionary leap, a stack of mastabas reaching for the heavens. This evolved into the smooth-sided geometric marvels at Giza, the ultimate expressions of a god-king's power, meant to be seen and admired for millennia. Yet their very visibility was their greatest weakness. The immense wealth buried within these towering landmarks made them irresistible targets for thieves. So the pharaohs of the New Kingdom made a brilliant, desperate shift. They abandoned the desert plateau for a secluded, sun-scorched valley on the west bank of Thebes, the Valley of the Kings. Here, they traded monumental glory for hidden security. Their tombs were now carved deep into the heart of the limestone cliffs, long, descending corridors and chambers hidden from view. The grand public monuments were now the temples on the fertile east bank, while the actual body was secreted away in a hidden, heavily guarded labyrinth, all in a frantic race to protect the king's eternal form. But what filled these hidden homes? The tomb was packed with a complete and functional household for the afterlife. There were chests of linens and clothing, jars of precious oils and wine, baskets of grain, and even joints of meat, all meant to magically sustain the spirit. There was furniture, from elegant chairs to simple stools, so the deceased could rest in comfort. There were weapons for protection, games like Senet for leisure, and musical instruments for joy. And then there were the Shabti dolls, some of the most charming and practical objects ever created. These were small mummiform figurines, often carved from faience or wood, and they came with a specific job. A spell inscribed on each one commanded it to answer the call if the deceased was conscripted for labor in the afterlife. If the gods demanded you to irrigate a field or move a pile of sand, your Shabti would leap to life and do the work for you. Wealthy individuals were buried with hundreds of them, a full workforce overseen by foreman Shabtis carrying whips, ensuring their master would enjoy an eternity of leisure. The walls themselves were the most vital provision of all. They were not mere decoration. Every painted scene of the gods, every hieroglyphic inscription from the Book of the Dead was a magical reality. A picture of a table heaped with bread and beer was not a representation, it was a perpetual offering, a guarantee of endless sustenance. A detailed map of the underworld was a functional guide, showing the soul the correct path and the names of the demons it would need to pacify. To have your name and image carved and painted on the wall was to have them live forever. This is why the ancient Egyptians fought so hard to protect these spaces. A robbed tomb was more than a theft, it was a spiritual catastrophe, severing the connection between the living and the dead and condemning the soul to oblivion. The tomb was the final, crucial anchor, tethering the reborn spirit to a perfect, eternal version of the life it had known and loved along the Nile. The sheer scale of the Karnak temple complex could swallow a dozen cathedrals. While the pyramids were sealed tombs for a single pharaoh's journey, the great temples were vibrant, beating hearts of the nation, constantly alive with ritual and activity. Think of Karnak not as a single building, but as a divine city, a sprawling complex built, expanded, and enriched by generation after generation of pharaohs over 2,000 years. This was the earthly home of the god Amun-Ra, and its primary function was to house his sacred statue, which was believed to contain his living spirit. Within the temple's deepest, darkest sanctuary, only the high priest and the pharaoh could enter to wash, dress, and feed the god's statue each day. This daily ritual was essential, for by caring for the god, they sustained the very cosmos, ensuring the sun would rise and the Nile would flood. But these temples were far more than just spiritual centers. They were also immense economic powerhouses. The Temple of Amun at Karnak owned vast tracts of farmland, fleets of ships, and legions of laborers. It functioned as a giant corporation, controlling grain, gold, and trade, with its own administration and scribes rivaling that of the royal palace itself. To approach this divine city, you first had to pass between two massive sloping towers called a pylon. This was the gateway between the profane world and the sacred precinct. Beyond it lay open courtyards, and then you would enter the most awe-inspiring space of all, the hypostyle hall. Here you stood in a forest of stone. 134 colossal columns rose like giant papyrus plants, their capitals blooming high above your head. The central columns were so wide that 6 adults linking hands could not encircle one. The sheer weight of the stone roof they supported was calculated to crush the human spirit, to make you feel infinitesimally small in the presence of the divine. Scattered sunlight filtered down from the high, narrow windows, illuminating the painted reliefs on every surface that showed the pharaoh performing perfect rituals for the gods. He was always depicted as the sole intermediary, the perfect priest, reinforcing his divine right to rule for every elite official who walked these halls. For the common people, this hall was the limit of their access. They were not permitted further into the gods' private rooms. Their worship happened in the outer courts, where they might leave a small offering or pray to a statue, hoping for a glimpse of the god's bark during a festival. Rising from these courtyards were the obelisks, single shafts of red granite quarried from a swan and capped with electrum to catch the first and last rays of the sun. These were not just decorative monuments, they were frozen sunbeams, physical connections between the earth and the sun god Ra. their pointed tips a conduit for divine energy. Every element of this sacred architecture was a symbolic reenactment of the moment of creation. The floor slowly rose as you moved inward from the bright, public courtyards to the dark, hidden sanctuary, just as the first mound of earth emerged from the primordial waters of chaos. The hypostyle hall, with its papyrus and lotus columns, represented that first fertile marsh teeming with life. The temple was a machine for maintaining creation, a bulwark against chaos built in stone. It told a story of order, power, and divine favor that every person, from the illiterate farmer to the educated scribe, could understand simply by walking through it, feeling its immense weight, and knowing that within its walls the gods were alive and the world was held in balance. Behind the colossal statues of pharaohs, the royal women of Egypt orchestrated power from the shadows and sometimes seized it directly in the light. The most influential of these was the great royal wife, a title far beyond that of a mere consort. She was the pharaoh's essential partner, a living symbol of the divine feminine necessary to complete his sacred rule. In religious ceremonies, she played the role of a goddess, performing rituals that mirrored those of her husband to maintain the balance of mat. She was a key political advisor, often managing her own vast estates and diplomatic correspondence, her influence weaving through the very fabric of the state. This position created a platform from which a woman of ambition and intelligence could ascend to unprecedented heights. Consider the case of Hatshepsut. When her husband died, leaving a young son as heir, she began as a regent, a temporary steward for the boy king, but she did not remain in the background. In a breathtaking political and theological maneuver, she declared herself Pharaoh, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. To legitimize her rule in a male-dominated office, she had herself depicted in official art as a man with a muscular, bare-chested torso and the traditional false beard. She ruled for over 2 decades of peace and prosperity, and her legacy is one of magnificent architecture, most famously her breathtaking mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, a terraced marvel cut into the cliffs. Then there is Nefertiti, the great royal wife of the controversial pharaoh Akhenaten. Her famous bust reveals a woman of stunning and confident beauty, but her power was very real. During Akhenaten's religious revolution, which upended centuries of tradition to worship a single sun god, Aten, Nefertiti was elevated to near equal status. Art from this period shows her standing alongside her husband, smiting foreign enemies in a pose previously reserved solely for the male pharaoh, or driving her own chariot. She was a core part of his new divine order, a co-ruler in both religion and statecraft. These women were exceptions, yet they proved the rule that the system held space for female authority. Even without becoming pharaoh, a royal woman as a regent for a young son could effectively rule the empire for years. Others served as high priestesses of powerful deities like Ammon, controlling the temple's immense wealth and political influence. They managed complex household economies that were essentially large corporations, employing hundreds. So while ancient Egyptian society was fundamentally patriarchal, with inheritance and official titles flowing through the male line, the story of its royal women is not one of simple powerlessness. It is a narrative of nuanced influence, of political genius, and of the remarkable individuals who, when circumstance and capability aligned, stepped out from the pharaoh's shadow to shape history themselves. The rigid world of gods and pharaohs was suddenly, violently upended by a single ruler. In the 14th century before the Common Era, a new pharaoh named Akhenaten ascended the throne and unleashed a theological earthquake upon Egypt. With a radical and uncompromising vision, he declared the worship of the myriad traditional gods to be obsolete. In their place, he elevated a single, supreme deity, the Aten, represented purely as the radiant disk of the sun. This was not merely a new god added to the pantheon. It was a complete rejection of the entire spiritual system that had sustained Maat for over 1,000 years. The old gods were erased, their temples closed, and the powerful priesthood of Ammon, which had grown to rival the royal palace in wealth and influence, was effectively stripped of its power. Akhenaten did not stop at religious reform. He turned his back on the ancient capital of Thebes, a city saturated with the presence of Ammon, and ordered the construction of an entirely new capital from scratch. He called it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, built on a barren plain in Middle Egypt, a place with no prior history or divine associations. This new city, known today as Amarna, was his perfect, pristine canvas for a new world order. Every aspect of life here was dedicated to the cult of the sun disk. The art that flourished in this strange new capital was as shocking as the theology itself. Gone were the idealized, muscular forms of Pharaoh's past. In their place, a startlingly naturalistic and oddly distorted style emerged. Official reliefs and statues depicted Akhenaten with an elongated face, a thin neck, a potbelly, and wide, feminine hips. His wife, the famous Nefertiti, and their children were shown with similar, exaggerated features. This was a conscious break from artistic tradition, perhaps meant to symbolize the royal family's otherworldly connection to the Aten, showing them as unique beings, fundamentally different from ordinary humanity. The art also captured moments of unprecedented intimacy, showing the king and queen playing with their daughters, kissing them, and basking in the rays of the Aten, rays that ended in tiny hands holding the ankh, the symbol of life, directly to their nostrils. For nearly 2 decades, this revolution held sway. The great question that has puzzled historians ever since is why. Was Akhenaten a true monotheistic visionary, the first individual in history to conceive of a single, universal god? Or was his revolution a brilliant, cynical political strategy to crush the Ammon priesthood, whose economic and political power had become a direct threat to the throne? By declaring himself the sole prophet of the Aten, Akhenaten centralized all religious and state authority back into his own hands. The answer likely lies somewhere in between, a blend of deep personal conviction and shrewd political calculation. But his new order was fragile, built on the force of his own personality and maintained by his absolute power. When Akhenaten died, his revolution died with him. His young successor, the boy King Tutankhamun, was quickly persuaded by the traditional priesthood to renounce the heresy. The court abandoned the city of Amarna, which was left to the desert sands. The names of Akhenaten and his god were systematically chiseled out of monuments, erased from the official king lists, and condemned to oblivion. The old gods were restored with a vengeance, and Egypt rushed back to the comforting, ancient rhythms of Maat, as if this strange, sun-drenched interlude had been nothing but a fever dream. The shimmering power of the new kingdom could not glow forever. A slow decay began to eat at the foundations of the empire, a corrosion from within as much as an assault from without. The great institutions that had once guaranteed stability started to fracture. In the shadow of the grand temples, corruption festered. Local governors and officials, far from the eyes of the pharaoh, grew greedy, siphoning taxes and demanding bribes. The sacred tombs, those eternal homes for the dead, became targets. Desperate men, often the very workers who had built them, tunneled into the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, braving curses to steal the gold and jewels meant to sustain a soul for eternity. Each robbed tomb was more than a crime. It was a spiritual crisis, a tear in the fabric of Maat that shook the people's faith in the cosmic order. Perhaps most dangerously, the priesthood of Ammon at Thebes had grown into a state within a state. Its wealth from vast landholdings and tributes now rivaled the royal treasury, and its high priests wielded political power that sometimes challenged the authority of the pharaoh himself. The very partnership between the king and the gods, the bedrock of Egyptian society, was cracking under the weight of its own success. As internal unity weakened, terrifying new enemies gathered at the edges of the map. The eastern Mediterranean world was thrown into chaos by the mysterious sea peoples. a confederation of warriors from across the sea who attacked in great numbers, destroying entire empires. The Egyptian navy fought them to a standstill in a great, desperate battle at the river mouths, but the cost was staggering. The profitable trade routes that had brought Lebanese cedar and Aegean oils were shattered. From the western deserts, Libyan tribes saw their chance, pressing into the delta, settling on the rich farmland and further straining the kingdom's resources. Egypt was exhausting itself, fighting on multiple fronts against foes it could not fully defeat. The empire shrank, its foreign holdings were lost, and the flow of tribute that had once filled the granaries and workshops slowed to a trickle. One by one, foreign powers began to rule the two lands. First came the Nubians from the south, once a conquered territory, who now marched north to claim the Pharaohs' throne for themselves. Then a more brutal force arrived, the Assyrians, with their iron weapons and a terrifying reputation for cruelty. They sacked Thebes itself, the spiritual heart of Egypt, carrying away its incalculable wealth. Later, the mighty Persian Empire absorbed Egypt into its vast domains, treating the Nile Valley as a rich province to be taxed and controlled. The unthinkable had happened. Egypt was no longer a master of its own destiny. The final blow to the ancient pharaonic line came not with a brutal conquest, but with the arrival of a young Macedonian king. Alexander the Great was welcomed as a liberator from the Persians, and he was wise enough to respect the old gods, even being declared the son of Ammon at the oracle of Siwa. But his conquest marked the definitive end. When Alexander died, his general Ptolemy took control of Egypt, founding a dynasty of Greek-speaking pharaohs. The age of the native Egyptian god-kings was over. The stage was now set for a new, hybrid world, the world of the Ptolemies, and their most famous queen, Cleopatra, would be the last to sit on a pharaoh's throne, ruling an Egypt that was forever changed. Their world was built on the belief that every action, from a pharaoh's ritual to a farmer's harvest, wove a thread into the eternal tapestry of man. We have walked through the rhythm of their days, from the social pyramid that gave their society structure to the intimate family bonds that gave it heart. We have smelled the bread baking in their mud-brick homes and felt the coarse linen of their sons' smart clothes. We have seen the farmer toil by the shaduf and the scribe etch his careful marks, each person playing a part in a civilization that saw its work as a sacred duty. Their faith was not confined to grand temples, but lived in the household prayers to Bes and the profound hope for a heart lighter than a feather in the final judgment. They approached life, death, and the cosmos with a unique vision, seeking to create harmony in a world flanked by chaos. While their colossal pyramids and towering temples are the legacy that first captures our eye, their true, enduring triumph lies in the stories they left behind. These stories of family meals, legal disputes, and personal hopes connect us to them across the millennia. The ancient Egyptians sought to live in harmony with the universe and build a legacy that would last for eternity. In many ways, through the stories they left behind, they succeeded. We would love to hear which part of their ancient world resonated most with you. Was it their beliefs about the afterlife, their daily meals, or the lives of their children? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more gentle explorations into the mysteries of our shared past.